Wade, Highland Park, Secret World Books. Thank you so much for coming to discuss We Survived the Night and a little bit about my documentary Sugarcane. You chose a section at the end of a chapter called Sky Woman, where I sort of sum up this little section of the book. So I think it's also a good sum up of the book in a way. So I'm glad you picked it. I grew up in Oakland, and most of my relatives reside in Cannon Lake. But I travel often to Mount Curry, some 200 miles south of Cannon Lake, on winding and dangerous mountain pass roads to visit one of Pa's last living siblings, my Auntie Martina Pierre, a sky woman in her own right, at her house in the shadow of Tazil. On one such visit, Martina told me a story. Decades ago, her family was falling apart. Her daughter had a child on the way, but was living on the streets of East Vancouver addicted to drugs and alcohol. Martina tried everything to heal her girl intervention, treatment. But Auntie believed it was this colonized world that was making her daughter spiritually sick. So she turned to tradition. She prayed, she bathed in the icy creeks, and she went to the sweat lodge. In one of those ceremonies, a spider came to her and offered her a song for her family. Today, it's an indigenous feminist anthem known as the Women's Warrior Song. I've heard it sung countless times at Native gatherings and protests across the continent. It begins with the singer calling in the ancestors. Hey, hey, hey. Then the ancestors respond. Yah-hee-oh-ho, yah-hee-oh-ho, hey, hey, yah-hee-oh, yah-hee-oh-ho, hey, hey, yah-hee-oh. In 2013, when I was 20, I stopped at Auntie's for tea. As we sipped lemon ginger in her kitchen, Auntie brought out a beautiful basket woven in the form of a tray with a six-pointed star on its belly, its weaver inspired by the sky. The basket was big enough to rest an infant inside, and it was made by Kihya. Our people believe we are echoes of ancestors, usually for better, but also sometimes for worse. We are the inheritors of mythological achievements and tricksterly foibles. We're the children of fathers who abandoned and relatives who picked up. We tell these stories to remind ourselves who we are, where we come from, and what we've been through. We tell these stories because we see ourselves in them, even when they're not explicitly about us. Because we are Coyote, Stump, Sky Woman, Spider, and all the rest. Canham Lake and Mount Curry, Tsikeskaneb and Liwat Ulth. And though we were made to forget all that by the missionaries, sometimes years and generations later, these places, stories, and ancestors come full circle to carry us back to where we belong. The book itself, I got the contract to write it about 5 years ago. I had never written a book before, obviously, and not long after that, I was not only writing a book but also co-directing a documentary for the first time in my life, and I had never even directed a TikTok before that. So, it has been an amazing 4 or 5 years of creative life for me. And I have just really loved to get to to tell the story of Indigenous peoples across, the United States and Canada, beginning with a personal narrative and expanding outwards from there into a sort of continent-wide portrait of indigeneity. I would say that the book's starting point was really when I decided to do something probably a bit unusual for at the time. I was 28 when I started writing this book. I decided to move in with my dad, which, if you read the book, was a probably unusual decision because he left when I was about 6 years old, and I hadn't seen him much since then. And so at 28, I found myself suddenly living across the hallway from, my father, who still owed me the money that I'd loaned him to come to my own high school graduation, just to give you sort of a tragicomic sense of the relationship. And not only did we reconnect, not only did I learn his story, but in the process of living together, the book transformed and became this coyote story, this coyote epic, really, about Indigenous life across Canada and the United States. And just really briefly, the trickster coyote, which is a major figure in my people's mythology, We considered him to be one of our first ancestors. And we traced our lineage and our understanding of the world through stories about him. And I actually hadn't ever learned any of those stories because this art form has nearly died out because of colonization. And so, actually, while I was living with my dad, I was doing the research for my book and I was reading these old oral histories on like, in old ethnographic texts from like 100 plus years ago that I was like finding on JSTOR and Google Scholar and that sort of a thing. I guess that's kind of the reality of being an Indigenous person sometimes in the modern day is you have to learn about yourself and your culture through the internet. um, and so I was reading in the PDF, about our trickster forefather Coyote, this deadbeat dad, survivor, epic creator, destroyer. And then I was kind of looking across the hallway at my new roommate, my own father, this, you know, creators, destroyer, epic deadbeat dad, survivor. And, it just kind of hit me that like my father was the trickster coyote. And that insight fundamentally transformed the book that I was writing, as the coyote tends to. The coyote is a transformer. And it led me to ask something that I'd never seen asked of narrative nonfiction writ large, which was, would it be possible to write a book that took the coyote stories seriously as nonfiction? And that's kind of what made the book what it is. I hoped that the film and now the book would speak to people who, both had like insider knowledge of what it is to be Indigenous, what it is to be Secwepemc or Statliunk specifically, but also to, a broader audience than that. I think to an audience of people whose families survived these institutions, and then to an audience of people who might be interested in understanding more about Indigenous history and culture and the present of Indigenous peoples. I think it's important to point out that like Indigenous stories are very often told in the past tense. And so, this is a book that's about Indigenous life largely today. Um, and then, beyond that, I also would say that Indigenous peoples were often not given the opportunity to be examples of the universal. And yet, you know, this is a story that whether you are interested in Indigenous subjects or not, it gets at questions of our relationships to our family, to our, fathers and sons and parents. It's about our relationship to our land and our place, our culture, our traditions. It's about questions of survival. What does it mean to live? What does it mean to live the good life? Questions of meaning, all of that sort of stuff. And I think that those are questions that are not just relevant to Indigenous peoples. I think that those are things that all humans have always struggled with and that feel especially relevant right now in a moment in time when I think lots of people are looking for connection and meaning in the world. So I was really fortunate to get to work on Sugarcane at the same time as I was writing We Survived the Night. And, there is a little bit of overlap between the two, but they are independent projects. You don't have to like watch Sugarcane to read We Survived the Night or read We Survived the Night to watch Sugarcane. Although if you choose to do both, like thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And, I think that one thing I learned was firstly that you have to like go all the way there with your stories. I think that part of what is unique about nonfiction is that it's an art form that is based upon how you choose to live and observe your life in relation to your stories. And so, as I said, I chose to move in with my dad. I spent a ton of time after living on the East Coast for a decade in my own community, in the life of my own family. That meant I attended 10 funerals while I wrote We Survived the Night. I took up a new ceremonial commitment in my community and my culture to fast, which is a part of how I divide the three sections of the book is through little poetic interstitial moments that are about each of the 4 days of the fast that we do, with no food and no water on about the summer solstice. Um, and I think that if you consider the fact that Indigenous cultures and ways of life and telling stories are imperiled, then choosing to not just tell an Indigenous story, but to live an Indigenous life in relation to the story that you're trying to tell, with your relatives, with your culture, with your people, with your land, that can be a really profound thing. And in a certain sense, telling these stories called me to do that. So I think that that's a very powerful thing that I learned from nonfiction. And then beyond that, I would say that like, you know, the technique of filmmaking, the film came out like a little bit before the book, and one of the things you learn when you're editing a documentary is that you can cut up a narrative many different ways to put it back together until it really sort of works. And as a writer, you know, I'm often super attached to or was super attached to the way that the words were originally put down onto the paper. And that experience of editing a documentary was super liberating in that it showed me like, you know, you can cut up and put back together a narrative a bunch of times until you find something that's like close to, you know, the way it's supposed to be, which for this book was especially helpful because I'm weaving together different, what people would usually consider different genres of nonfiction writing. I'm weaving together memoir and family history, reportage, and oral history, which is sort of a, to my knowledge, that really hadn't been done before, you know, a nonfiction book that took a trickster tradition seriously as nonfiction. And so to do that, you know, I had to be really thoughtful about the weaving and the structure. And, you know, I use that metaphor weaving very purposefully as well, because for my people, as I sort of I reference weaving in that section that I just read, you know, for my people, weaving is kind of considered the highest art form. And so the structure of the book itself is also echoing the weavers in my family line. I would say the last thing is just like, you know, when you're making a documentary about the system that nearly wiped our people and our way of life off the face of the earth at the same time as you're writing a book about, you know, indigeneity, broadly speaking, you inevitably ask yourself, you know, what parts of that culture and way of life do you as a storyteller, as a writer, have a responsibility to bring back to life on the page, which is part of what led me to, you know, the coyote stories as a major thread in the work. This is a tradition that was passed orally for thousands of years, that still, you know, recalls essential parts of our ancestral memory. You know, it correctly situates, for example, an event that happened 11,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, as I write about in the book. And I think that that kind of a tradition, you know, if it can pinpoint something that happened thousands of years before the pyramids, before the writing the Bible, like, I don't know, I think you kind of have to take it seriously. And, you know, it's worth pointing out that, like, that's never happened. Indigenous peoples and our ways of telling stories, you know, I went to a college where we had to read the great works of Western civilization as part of the core curriculum. And would it have been so hard for us to read like a 10-page version of Coyote Steals the Salmon in that curriculum? I don't think so. I'm going to be on Alcatraz for the sunrise ceremony on Thanksgiving. The sunrise ceremony, so they do it on Thanksgiving as well as Indigenous Peoples Day, and so there's about 5,000 people who come, and it's a big sort of commemoration of the occupation, and they also talk about the history, and the 19 Hopi elders usually get brought up. I hope that the conversation goes well, and yeah, thank you again. I'm really, really grateful.